In this news roundup of the week for Friday, November 21st, 2025, the text of Trump's Ukraine surrender plan is made public, and the president threatens that Ukraine sign it or else. Japan's new prime minister is facing the start with a massive confrontation with China over Taiwan, and the UK has just released the detailed COVID-19 inquiry report. After 3 years and £200 million, did it actually tell us something useful? All right, well, let's jump straight in. Sad to say, everything that I've said since Trump came back to office about how he intended to get peace in Ukraine, i.e. give Russia exactly what it wants, force Ukraine to accept it, well, that has just been borne out. We now have the draft text of the so-called peace plan, hereafter to be referred to as the Ukraine surrender plan. But more than that, it's coming out that Trump is insisting that Ukraine has to sign this plan by Thursday next week, or else the US will cut off weapons and intelligence sharing. And there it is, as predicted. And so I have to repeat myself again. The United States is clearly an adversary of Ukraine, not an ally. De facto, that is the implication of what's been happening, and yet Ukraine and Europe have continued to act as though all they need to do is win Trump over and it will be much more like business as usual. Well, no. So what's in this 28-point surrender plan? Let's pull out some of the highlights, starting with 1. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. I mean, gee, don't do us any favours. Note where we are when that is put forward as though it is somehow a concession. 2. A comprehensive and comprehensive. You sure it's comprehensive enough? Non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine and Europe. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. Just like that, eh? Who'd have thought it would be that easy? 3. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighbouring countries and NATO will not expand further. So it's expected, eh? Nobody would ever go against something as concrete as expectations. 4. And this one's interesting in a Freudian slip kind of a way. A dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, to resolve all security issues. Notwithstanding that Trump's America is acting as a one-sided participant, so is not suitable for a mediation role, it's worth noting it's also supposed to be a member of NATO. So the fact it thinks it can put itself forward as a mediator between Russia and NATO, as though it were wholly independent, well, let's just say it would be jaw-dropping if it had come from any other administration. Then we're on to point 5. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. From Trump's America? Really? The one that's trying to blackmail Ukraine into signing the deal? Sure, they're going to rely on that. And point 6, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 people. Why? Well, the only conceivable reason is so that Russia, despite those expectations, can invade them again in the future. I mean, it is the sort of clause you might impose on an aggressor to make sure they're never in a position to invade their neighbours again. But there's no suggestion of that. Russia can have as many forces as it wants. Ukraine surrender, in other words. 7. Ukraine never to join NATO, which is fair enough because it's become wholly dysfunctional, at least until they admit that the US has crashed out of it and reformulate. 8. NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. So limited Ukraine armed forces, no supplementation by supportive European neighbours. Then we have 10. The US guarantee. And the first concrete US guarantee, the one we definitely believe will be delivered, come what may. The US will receive compensation for the guarantee. Now that we can believe. Money will be extracted by the Trump administration. Of course it will be. What does Ukraine get in return? All we know is this sub-clause. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive, coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated, recognition of the new territory, and all other benefits of this deal will be revoked. If that was a grown-up settled promise by the United States to directly be involved in the military defence of Ukraine if Russia invades, that would start to be the sort of guarantee Europeans had wanted. If it was that, hard to understand why you then have to go on about all the sanctions being reimposed, because surely that would then be the least of it. But there's three other problems. One, the Trump administration has not said explicitly what it means. Two, the Trump administration is incapable of giving grown-up promises of this sort, but it can be held to in the future. And three, if they were serious, they wouldn't be proposing that no NATO troops could be stationed on Ukraine's territory. Then there's more stuff about how the United States will enrich itself through the redevelopment of post-war Ukraine, although that's not exactly how it's worded, that is kind of what it means. Then Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. Russia agrees to enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine, because that should definitely stop Putin in his tracks. Meanwhile, Ukraine, with its limited military, also avoids any development of nuclear weapons, so it has nothing left. Now this one's interesting. Point 20, which says both countries should implement educational programs in schools aimed at promoting understanding and tolerance of different cultures, which sounds kind of woke to me, but never mind. But then there's a subclause C that reads like this: all Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. Now, this is very remarkable. Whenever European countries seek to outlaw Nazi-sympathising parties, they get lectured by J.D. Vance and Elon Musk that they're prohibiting free speech. Not entirely sure they thought that one through. Then you get the territories, and as trailed, yes, point 21 would involve Ukraine gifting territory to Russia that it hasn't been able to conquer by force of arms. They try to make it slightly more palatable by suggesting that territory vacated voluntarily by Ukraine would be treated as a demilitarized buffer zone. Now, of course, it would officially become Russian, internationally recognized as such, according to the deal, but Russia would make a pinky promise that its armed forces would never enter that zone. Point 22. After agreeing on future territorial arrangements, both the Russian Federation and Ukraine undertake not to change these arrangements by force. Any security guarantees will not apply in the event of a breach of this commitment, which of course is a total one-way sanction, because security guarantees are being provided to Ukraine, not to Russia. So why would Russia care two hoots about this clause when it decides to resume hostilities? Point 25. Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Why is that part of a peace agreement? Surely wholly Ukraine's business. Oh no, that's right. It's a surrender agreement. Sorry, I forgot. Point 27. This agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council, headed by President Donald J. Trump. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. Legally binding with who? I mean, it's laughable. And the idea that Trump, demonstrably biased towards Russia, that he presides over the process, I mean, you couldn't make it up. So this is the deal that President Trump wants Ukraine to sign, or else. At this stage, you would hope that the European allies would now drop the pretense, would say, OK, the game is up, time to make a stand against the US attempts to bully Ukraine into surrender. That, however, does not seem to be the approach at the point of shooting this video. Reportedly, the UK's Keir Starmer and France's Emmanuel Macron, quote, welcomed efforts of the US, but called for a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Look, I'm sorry, this is an attempted shakedown on behalf of the most determined enemy of the West, and you're going to still praise and flatter Trump, say, yay, but maybe we could have a quiet word about the details? That, having a word about the details part, is that the UK, France, Germany and Ukraine are supposed to be working on a counter-proposal. Well, good luck with that. Some might suggest this response would best be described as pathetic. Obviously, I couldn't possibly comment. In any case, so many of these points beg huge questions that it's a wholly unfeasible document anyway. Simply saying a comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded doesn't just make it happen. A dialogue will be held to resolve all security issues. Well, I expect if it was that easy, it probably would have happened by now. But in advance of the detail of those magical processes, Ukraine is meant to sign its future away, or else, all based on the promises of a person who has done nothing for them in the 10 months that he's been president. Now, you would say, obviously, that's not going to happen. So does that mean the US now does its best to make Ukraine lose the war? Bear in mind, the US currently is not itself providing weapons as support to Ukraine. It did agree to sell weapons to European countries who could then choose to donate them to Ukraine. So is it going to simply refuse to sell those weapons to those European countries from now on? Quite possibly. Withdrawal from intelligence support obviously is on the cards and totally within their power. Russia will be delighted. They've probably just been hoping that indulging Trump with a draft surrender document would mean that he would hold off on the oil sanctions that were supposed to kick in around about now. Ukraine's President Zelensky said it clearly. He said that Ukraine is at one of the most difficult moments of its history, that it faces losing dignity or losing US support, which causes a false choice because Ukraine doesn't have US support. So it's being invited to lose its dignity for no gains whatsoever. Be clear, this is the United States acting now as an agent of Russia to force Ukraine into surrender in any substantive way or to enable them to be defeated militarily. It should be a moment of total moral clarity. It isn't clownish behaviour, it's not a colourful form of business as usual, it's the USA as predator, lining up with the world's greatest current predator, and doing so hoping for a peace prize. It's worth bearing this in mind as we cast our eyes on the geopolitical conflicts looming elsewhere, because Trump's America has been seeking to persuade various Southeast Asian countries that it is with them, side by side, against the rising power China. What's the value of those promises now, we wonder? Just weeks into the job of Prime Minister of Japan, Sanae Takaichi has provoked a storm with said rising power by suggesting that her country may respond militarily if China were to move against Taiwan, having done so being tacitly encouraged by Trump. And needless to say, this is not what Xi Jinping wanted to hear, with the US apparently adopting a strategy that pulls it away from being the world's policeman towards focusing instead on what it describes as being its own neighbourhood, i.e. the Western Hemisphere, starting with Venezuela. Xi Jinping may well have been entertaining the hope that it would all just fall into place over Taiwan. Trump proves that the US is no better an ally of it than it is of Ukraine. China then ramps up the military moves, step by step, ratcheting up, until finally Taiwan, and probably the rest of Southeast Asia as well, starts to realise that there's just no point in fighting it anymore, and China strikes up a deal with Taiwan that puts it on the path to being the next Hong Kong. Which is all very well, but if Taiwan feels it has a strong ally in its own region in the shape of Japan, this might well make it less likely to arrive at the desired sense of hopelessness. Now, from the outside, you may wonder at this. Japan, after all, is a small country next to China, even if its economy is big. Not only that, but it has had an anti-militarist policy for so many decades after World War II, so surely it's all just noise. Well, it's important to remember how big a part of China's recent institutional memory is that of having been occupied by Japan, an occupation that was long-lasting and pretty savage on all historical standards. Anti-Japanese sentiment is strong in the country. No one would rule out that Japan could decide to rise again as a power in its own right. Takaichi had already ruffled those feathers before becoming Prime Minister by questioning some of the standard narratives around Japan's wartime atrocities. In the meantime, Xi Jinping is hitting back, using the same sort of economic muscle that seems to be becoming the standard way of doing business in the age of Trump. Although, to be fair, China did get there first, including indeed with Japan itself. So China has banned the purchase of Japanese seafood, amongst other things. This prompted the Taiwanese president to post a picture of himself eating Japanese sushi on social media, encouraging Taiwanese residents to show their appreciation and support for Japan. These are the sorts of ripples that spread across the world now the global order is unsettled. The emerging powers are fighting openly for dominance. It's wars of words and economic sanctions for now. China is clearly of the view that this won't be the case forever. So, for instance, the country has spent the last few months building up its oil reserves. This clearly was partly prompted by the awareness that Trump could choose to target them at any time, and a country that has to import energy, because it doesn't produce its own, it has clearly been seeking to reduce its vulnerability to supply disruption. It's working on getting domestic crude oil production going to insulate itself even more, but even in a fast-moving country like China, that necessarily takes quite a long time. Elsewhere, it's also looking to areas where it's in competition with the US for influence. One of those, as we discussed before, is Nigeria, as well as Africa more broadly. You will recall that Trump threatened to send in the troops into Nigeria due to the alleged persecution of Christians there. And it was typical Trump. Firstly, though there have been attacks against Christians, but also many others, his version of the story was garbled through the lens of conspiracy theory. Second, his response to this was to throw threats around. China was quick to demonstrate that it had a much more partnership-oriented approach to the country. James Barnett of the Hudson Institute said that the Nigerian President Abuja sees Beijing as the better partner because it's much more accommodating of his preferences and his position in the status quo. But plenty in Nigeria itself reportedly fear becoming pawns in the fight between the two powers. They feel that neither side really has their best interests at heart. African countries have a sharp recent history, after all, of seeing the major outside powers basically coming in order to extract their resources at the lowest possible price and the lowest benefit to the people who actually live there. Take a look at Trump's approach to Ukraine and Xi Jinping's approach to Japan. It's pretty hard to argue with the principle of that. And the world shouldn't be so quick to forget either the fact that COVID-19 came from China. And while there's still no concrete proof as to its exact origin, the Chinese leadership made every attempt to block inquiry and study to try to find out where it came from. It's not proof that it came from a Chinese laboratory, but it was also behaviour that sure looked like someone felt there might be something to hide. And while we're on that topic, the UK has just seen the publication of its major COVID-19 inquiry. This was the second part, the part that focused on policy choices, decision-making and governance during the pandemic. When the inquiry, which has taken 3 years and has cost over £200 million, was first set up, some people said it was going to be used to settle scores, to point fingers of blame for everything that was done. Others said, no. The purpose of doing this is that such a structured and methodical way, with over 100 people being interviewed in depth in public hearings, many thousands of pages of evidence, this will mean that we can learn the lessons, so we'll be better prepared next time. And lo and behold, it largely seems to have been about settling scores and attributing blame. The lesson seems to be that if you don't want a disaster in a time when there's a future pandemic, don't elect incompetent morons who couldn't govern their way out of a paper bag. Which, to be entirely honest, is a lesson I could probably get behind, although it seems very much against the spirit of the age. But the point is, In doing so, it mostly rehashes criticisms of different players that have already been played out in full in public long since. Yes, we know Boris Johnson was a weak and indecisive decision maker. Yes, constant micro changes to the COVID rules all the time left everyone bewildered and confused, a fact that I covered at the time, with some feeling as I recall. But some of the things that came out of it are not, on their face, relevant or even helpful to the brief of the inquiry, even if they are true. So the chair of the commission, Baroness Heather Hallett, slated Johnson's special advisor Dominic Cummings for, quote, using offensive and misogynistic language and generally being a pain in the backside, which may be true. What's it got to do with the policy choices around COVID-19 or anything else that we could learn from in terms of managing a crisis in the future? The answer really is nothing. It's just part of the finger pointing. The inquiry isn't supposed to be about what a disgraceful shower the Boris Johnson government was. We agree about that. It was. Surely we didn't spend £200 million just to hear that repeated back to us. On the other hand, the inquiry seemed to take certain presentations that it heard too uncritically, without scepticism, without asking searching questions, which generated yet more of the sensationalist headlines. So, for example, it is presented as fact that if only Boris Johnson hadn't dithered and had locked the country down 1 week earlier, it would have saved 23,000 deaths. One of the big and most powerful critiques after COVID was of how model projections had been used, and arguably occasionally misused, always using the worst case scenarios in presentations because they were seeking to win public obedience to policy measures, always presenting them with an air of certainty that was proven to be highly questionable. So this suggestion, 23,000 lives, very specific number, would definitely have been saved by a certain policy being done 1 week earlier. And it's weird because later on in the report it makes criticisms of the use of figures from models. But then that's exactly what it uses itself. Largely because, if the exercise really is about finger pointing, it's just too good a headline to pass up. The fact is that it's very hard to quantify what the difference something like that really made. Just about everyone caught COVID in the end within the first 6 months. Would an earlier lockdown really have prevented those deaths? Or would it have spread them out more thinly over the coming 6 months? The inquiry doesn't know because it didn't look at that question. It spoke to people who had various assumptions. They repeated those assumptions. No original work was done to reassess them in the light of experience. Everyone just said what they'd always said. For all the policy differences in countries across the world, and certainly across Europe and certain others where many of the societal factors are broadly similar, there was no simple relationship between one type of policy followed and one type of outcome achieved. The people who went rather quickly from reasonably based scepticism about strict lockdowns as a policy, they drifted all the way to full-on anti-vax and or COVID denialism. So the fact that they focused on Sweden and made various exaggerated claims for what it proved, maybe that meant the inquiry decided not to go down that route. But for me, the big question that deserved to be answered was probably this. The big issue with the UK lockdowns, as far as I could see, apart from the ridiculous day-to-day micromanaging, was the absence of any granting of people to use their judgment or common sense within the spirit of the rules. So the rules were as they would have been for children. No negotiation, no wiggle room, no exceptions. You are not allowed to see aged parents in care homes. Even if you've isolated for a week, you just can't. And if they're dying and it means you'll never see them again, too bad. Boo-hoo. Poor you. Follow the rules. Also, you're only allowed to go outdoors for exercise once a day. A rule that makes 0 sense, and we knew made 0 sense at the time. There were many things we didn't know at the start, but exercising outdoors alone or with other members of your own household was always obviously safe. But the rule was the rule. We don't trust you to think. Do exactly as we say. So we had police buzzing people walking on the moors, with drones telling them off for unnecessarily being outside, as if you could catch COVID-19 from sheep or something. What they did in Sweden was that they, yes, brought in about 80% of the same social distancing rules, but they still treated people as adults, gave them some discretion, some judgment. Some people claim they just didn't have lockdowns at all, but that's not really the case. There was a significant reduction of social contact. There was still very much policy. Now, can you compare the two country situations exactly like for like? Of course not. There are so many variables that affect the outcomes. But was it a more humane policy that had fewer of the economic and health impacts of lockdown as it was imposed in the UK? Sure. Ironically, this distinction is what brought Johnson's government down. Because in the policy where you empower everyone to use their judgments with guidance within the number of the rules, the small number of hard lines, then having a staff drinks gathering amongst people who already work together in the same office wouldn't have been an aberration. Everyone would have been able to do it. Common sense. But in the micromanaging rulebook where you're not allowed to use any judgments, just follow the rules to the letter, well, in that case, the people in charge also have to follow the rules to the letter. And if they don't, it is a massive betrayal of trust, to be answered by outrage on behalf of the country and a £200 million exercise in blame game and finger pointing to confirm what we already know, apparently. Hallett's report claims that if Boris Johnson had acted a week earlier, then Britain could have followed Sweden's policy. But by being late, it meant it had to be a full lockdown. There is no evidence presented that justifies that assertion. It's actually quite a weird statement to make at all. Also, the report makes passing reference to the fact that the costs of lockdown, economic and health issues particularly, were not quantified or taken into account when decisions were being made. There's no attempt to do this now that we have some distance and hindsight to draw from. Surely that's what you should be doing in this. The challenge was always that COVID-19 was seen as a single variable problem. Everything was about pushing down deaths from COVID-19, not maximising human well-being, just target COVID. We know there was a spike in cancers soon afterwards because a lot of the routine screening that would have been happening did not happen. We know for a fact that children were massively impacted from having schools closed. So what you may be wondering, according to this report, should we do next time that's different? Well, other than the don't elect drongos position, which remains implied rather than stated to be fair, it's pathetically thin gruel, based on organisational niceties and presuming a future pandemic will be identical to the last one. So it says this: interventions must be imposed earlier and harder than might be considered ideal. It's a statement that can only be made if you've really failed to look at both sides of the balance sheet. Because what if the next pandemic shows early signs of being less lethal than COVID was? How do you judge the trading off of the harms behind early and hard action versus whatever the harms may be of that virus with all of whatever its unique features are? According to this, there is no trade-off. Early and hard, always. And then there's some technocratic stuff about setting up a online portal for future emergencies, having a plan if your head of government personally gets taken out by the pandemic, as nearly happened to Boris Johnson. So, gee, guess that was well worth £200 million. The sad lesson from all of this is that however long and deliberative a process you have, you don't necessarily get value from it unless you ask the right questions and then address those questions with a degree of skill. Where's it left us? I would say our official policy for the next pandemic remains to cross our fingers and kind of hope it doesn't happen. All right. As you can tell, I had quite a lot to say on several of those topics, so no time for replying to comments this week. My thanks as always to the Patreon supporters who make these videos possible. That's all for now. Have a great weekend.